Oh, God. I've been working hard grading your papers. Go to the next slide, please.
Anthropology traditionally has 4 fields, but we're traditionally math challenged because the 4 fields in reality are 5. And they're not totally separate. And you'll find this out in the assignment that you have after this slideshow. So let's start. Archaeology, the study of the past. And by the past, it gets a little complicated because we're talking about non-human remains. We're talking about, for example, when I take the students to the Mayan country, we're talking about the former sites, we're talking about the tools, the animals and stuff. However, it's very closely linked to biological or physical anthropology, because in those remains, we will find humans and we'll find animals, and we can learn a lot too. So they're really almost inseparable, but that's just a branch of physical or biological anthropology that's very much alive today, as you'll see when we're looking at anything from forensic anthropologists who work for cities or forensic archaeologists, the same. When we look at our primates, our nearest ancestors, to figure out how we'd evolved. That evolved, I said devolved, whoops. That's kind of my commentary on the world. Then there's linguistics, the study of language. Not just translation, but how it's used, in what context it's used, and very important, how it doesn't have to be verbal. It could be something called kinesics, it could be signs, it could be mixing noises that we haven't heard, but how it's used and how it's received. And finally, there's what we're doing now, cultural or social. And it's a look at the cultures of peoples, comparison and contrast. But none of these could really be separated. And again, your assignment after this will demonstrate that to you. But the 5th branch is really applied. How are these used and by whom? So let's start now and look at archaeology. Artifacts, what is left behind? You should know these 2 movies, Lara Croft, Tomb Raider, and Indiana Jones series. Neither of them really do what archaeologists do. They're glorified versions. But they were both noted for going into ancient tombs, finding treasures, fighting off bad guys, which is actually a part of archaeology, because who owns what? And these are big disputes going on today. And that's a part of archaeology, and a very important part. Today, any city, municipality, in fact, that is digging a site for a new building has to hire an archaeologist in order to see what's underneath there. Recently in Philadelphia, they found a forgotten black graveyard. In New York City, they found a shipwreck. So they do have important laws today, rules today, as well as looking at the past. This is a group of my students and me about 4 years ago. One, I happened to be 50 pounds heavier. That's the truth. At Chichen Itza, the Pyramid of the Sun. And if you could see my mouse, which I don't know if you could see, twice a year at the solstice, you will see the sun go down the pyramid like a snake. We also look at other things. You've heard of the Neanderthal, big to anthropologists in many ways. Archaeologists love them, physical anthropologists love them, and now I love them too, because with recent DNA, I'm 4% their bro, it turns out. But one of the things the archaeologists found out were these cave paintings, which are up to 1,000 years old. We kind of think now that they did the paintings before the hunt in order to get the spirit of the animals. We also learned that they buried their dead. There used to be a myth that there were these brutes. So archaeologists just on the Neanderthal learn about burial, learn about the food they eat, the medicine they had. For example, we know they were able to do dental extracts, set broken arms. We know they had art. We know they believed in an afterlife. because what they buried with their dead. We know what they ate. We know how they used fire and how they used tools. Until about 15 years ago, we taught that they had not changed in 100,000 years. Now, never mind that one. We know they changed quite a bit. Another thing that archaeologists do, look at ancient sites. This is Machu Picchu in Peru, where I have been, but you probably haven't. It was a city of the Incas that wasn't so far off the main path that it wasn't discovered by the Westerners again until 1912. My older son and I hiked in there on what's called the Mayan Trail, and the altitude is so high that our tourist guide, because legally you have to have a guide on this trail, could not help but laughing at us for not keeping up. The problem was she was 7 months pregnant. So Machu Picchu, this is my son when he was 16, looking down on it. Some sites at the expanse where they did human sacrifices. But it's also, the altitude is really something. My younger son, who's now 25, got altitude sickness. But he survived, and there's the whole family together, just in case you wanted to see them, all three sons. Archaeology is the study of lifestyles of past cultures by examining their material remains. Also look at non-human artifacts. Data includes stone and bone tools, skeletal remains, pottery, and coprolite remains. Coprolite is fun. You know what it is? It's poop. Okay. And you can tell not only what they ate, but what plants and animals were nearby and how often they ate. Then there's a garbage project which goes on today. We find the best place to look is what people threw away. And graveyards tell us quite a bit too. Now, physical anthropology is very much linked to archaeology. It's the study of humans and non-human lives, past, present, yes, and future. And we'll look at a couple articles that talk about our future. My 5th grade teacher in Missouri said that we were all going to have right feet that were flat because all we did was we wouldn't walk anymore. We'd just put our foot on the gas pedal. Many physical anthropologists research animals such as primates in particular in order to understand human origins and human behavior. Bones, a very popular TV series, actually written by a physical anthropologist. Again, glamorized, but it was what a lot of physical anthropologists get hired for. We'll also look a little more detailed on what could be done with physical or biological anthropology. Plus, I got to sell a couple products. Genetics. A lot of genetics testing, very important. We're learning more and more about it, about its dangers also. We're learning how to cure diseases. We might be learning how to program perfect human beings, and I have perfect in quotes. But DNA is a big part of physical or biological anthropology. Evolution, extremely important, and every time we think we got it down, we know they have to change it. For example, if anybody's really interested in this, myself and Professor Ciora every spring teach a course on evolution, and several times during that course, we have to change the sequence because they find something new. We talked about the Neanderthal. When we first taught it, we thought the Neanderthal didn't know how to speak. Now we know they do. Time span went from 30,000 years ago to maybe 200,000 years ago. We also talk about primatology. Maybe you've heard of Jane Goodall, but the study of animals, primates, are nearest relatives in their natural habitat. And we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Ecology is extremely important today. And we're going to do a little bit of study later in the term about something called ecocide, which is what we're doing to ourselves as we destroy the world. So there is also the opportunity, and we also talk about nutrition. We used to be number one, the tallest people in the world. We're not anymore. Why? You will find out. In anthropology, we offer travel trips to Mayan Mexico or the Grand Canyon. We also have a course this spring on pre-Columbian civilizations, if you're interested. We also do forensics. Any city now doing excavations must hire an archaeologist to study what they find in graveyards and often to solve crimes. Paleopathology, looking at diseases from ancient people to the present. We know that maybe one of the reasons that the Neanderthal got wiped out was measles. Further, physical or biology. We talk a lot about the Neanderthal, partly because they're very close to us, actually closer than we used to think. But we also have more remains of them than other groups. We know they had their sloped foreheads. Yep, they had bigger brains than us. Their brows were sloped. Now, on the brains, we talk about that more in another course. The brains were less complex than ours, but they were bigger. They were very thickly muscled. That caused a problem for them later on because they couldn't really move around so quick. They had their adult teeth by 4. They had arthritis. This is a comparison. We finally have decided that their body could not cope with environmental change. And there is climate change. Sorry about that, Trump, but it really is an issue. However, we also have learned in the last year or two that they survived 2 other climate changes. So it wasn't just climate change or the change in game. This last time around, though, they had severe competition with the influx of Cro-Magnon, who were us. So they might have been out-talked, out-hunted, or more adaptable. Not the Cro-Magnon was more adaptable. Strongest of the fittest does not mean the strength. We also know that we got busy with them. My DNA has 4% Neanderthal. That was something that I was taught in graduate school happened. Since graduate school could not have happened, and now we know it did happen. We know they had art, they used makeup, they had no voice box, we used to think. Now we know they did have a voice box. They had cooked foods, they buried their dead. This must have been painful. They had 12 months gestation periods versus humans, 9 months. First, we thought they shared no DNA, but now we know they shared a lot with us. And we know that they had certain diseases. And that's as we learn more about the brain. So we learn a lot about the Neanderthal, about the environment, about our nearest ancestor, who's not a distant ancestor, but now a biological cousin. Take the course and you'll learn more. Then there's primatology, study of primates, Jane Goodell. Until she came around in the 1960s, primatologists would say that the strongest, loudest, biggest primates were those in charge. Those were based on zoo studies. And that was true in a confined environment. But when she started doing work in the field, particularly on velvet monkeys, she found out, in fact, that it wasn't always the strongest. It wasn't always the males, but it could be the cleverest that are in charge. And we'll look a little bit about this here, but that's also covered in the evolution course. Then there's the biological or physical.
Lucy, I'm home.
Oops, wrong Lucy's. Until 12 years ago, we thought Lucy was our oldest hominid, our oldest relative. She stood up. She walked on 2s rather than all 4s. That meant bipedal, use of her hip. She stood 3'7" in her stocking feet, 12 years old at death, but she was a mature adult. She had a relatively small brain, and she was reconstructed from 40 bones. When my son Sam was 4 years old, this is the type of bedtime story I used to tell him. He asked me, was Lucy's mother proud? And I said, what? He said, if Lucy was the first human, her mother must have been very proud. And to me, that shows how arbitrary all of this is. Obviously, Lucy had a mother. We found Lucy, so we know that she was, quote, the first, but she had to have a mother. And actually, her mother would not be so proud anymore, because in 2008, they found Artie. Move over, Lucy. 1994, she was found, but it wasn't published in 2008. Scattered skeletons, and she was 1.2 million years older than Lucy, and she was taller than Lucy. So it moved back our human ancestor at least that long. And she also demonstrated that humans split from the primates much earlier than we thought. So Artie was a big one for 4 feet tall. She had a small brain. Here's a bit of a sequence of how she grew. The split from the chimpanzees, and then you see little tiny Lucy over there. But some keys, she had grasping feet for climbing, big hands, was no sign of walking on her knuckles. Her pelvis also showed that she walked upright, and her teeth suggest a diet that was not just meat, but vegetable plants. Bipedal. Now, this is interesting. Survival of the fittest, most adapt. She was not nearly as big as other species of hominids at the time. And the forests were also shrinking at the time. So she probably got tossed out of the forest. But because she had this other quality, she was able to adapt. She could carry objects in her hands, including the young. She could see more around her surroundings. Her teeth were more adaptable. And big hands, unlike Donald Trump, and there was no signs of knuckle walking. So she was a tree climber who could live outside of the trees, where her relatives at that time could not live outside of the trees because they could not live upright. So what was not so adaptive when the forests were thick became very adaptable as they thinned out. Couple comparisons, and here's a brief video. Please watch it, don't skip ahead.
Is a fossil find that is turning evolution on its head. A team led by UC Berkeley researchers has identified a human ancestor who lived nearly 4.5 million years ago. Sharon Chin says it eclipses previous discoveries by 1 million years.
Ardipithecus ramidus, nicknamed Artie, is rocking evolutionary theory. She's believed to be 4.4 million years old.
It is one of the most revealing hominid fossils I could ever have imagined.
Scientists led by UC Berkeley and Ethiopian researchers say uncovering Artie's partial skeleton in the Ethiopian desert revolutionizes what we know about the earliest phase in the theory of human evolution.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
Leslia Lusko took part in the research, and she and Henry Gilbert helped with Artie's excavation. They say Artie shows we did not evolve from monkeys or chimpanzees.
We can now tell that that last common ancestor wasn't a chimpanzee. It wasn't like a chimpanzee. So this overturns that long-held hypothesis.
Scientists have come up with a life-size computerized reconstruction of Artie. She comes in at a little lower than my shoulder, about 4 feet tall and 110 pounds. Artie's believed to be more than 1 million years older than Lucy, up till now the oldest hominid fossil ever found, and Artie appears to give clues to when primates started walking upright.
Ardipithecus was a bipedal primate, walked on 2 legs, much like we do, except she had a grasping big toe, which is an incredibly odd form of bipedalism. She wasn't a great biped because she retained that grasping big toe, which meant she's really good at climbing in trees still.
Artie's partial skeleton, comprised of more than 100 pieces, caps 17 years of painstaking digging in the desert.
The bones were really fragile and they were spread out over kind of a broad area. You had to excavate with dental picks and porcupine quills, and it was like a small little clod of dirt at a time, grain by grain.
Details of Artie's groundbreaking discovery are published Friday in 11 scientific papers by 17 authors in 10 countries as scientists across the globe study Artie and an evolving theory of evolution. In Berkeley, Sharon Chin, CBS 5.
The scientists say they can also tell a lot about Artie from her teeth. They say they were small, indicating she was likely a peaceful creature and not aggressive.
And I hope you noticed they found her, but they took over a decade before they published because they knew that there would be a lot of pushback because we had written the books and we used ink rather than pencil, and it would be hard to change them. And it really did separate things. Now there's this notion of evolutionists versus creationism. Evolutionists believe that humans and all animals and plants are continuing to evolve and or become extinct with changes in the environment. Survival of the fittest, or the adaptation to the environment. Okay, whereas the creationists believe that humans are created by God. God created the world and all species, that there's a divine plan, but there is wiggle room for both. And that's what's really important, that in more complex courses, we actually respect both points of views. Then there's linguistics. Study of communication. Now, this is very important. Through mutually agreed abstract meanings. What means something in our culture might mean something else in another culture. I'll give you a quick example. There was a car in the 1960s, 70s called the Nova, N-O-V-A, okay? Big seller. They invested a lot of money selling the Nova in Mexico. Guess what? Break that into two words, no-va, doesn't go, okay? But also, you've had miscommunication. You've said one thing and it's been taken another way, or you've lied, probably more likely, and said that's not what I meant when the person took umbrage. But it's studies of agreed upon meanings. It originally emerged again out of this colonialism thing as they were using the language to document the intended disappearance of Native Americans. And they intentionally suppressed their languages as a way of controlling their culture. For over 100 years, ending in the 1970s, Native Americans were taken away from their reservations and put in schools run by missionaries and run by the government to break them of their culture. And linguistics ranges from study of how sounds are put together to how meanings are interpreted. And communication doesn't have to be just words. It could be signs, it could be gestures. We're going to read about the Apache, whose strongest form of communication is silence. And linguistics is very relevant today.
Alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Language as culture is always changing. Language is used in gender and power. Okay, and that's changed quite a bit. How many of you who are female were freshmen? Does that fit? But there's lots of studies, I think I'm going to spare you this semester, of gender speak. Men and women actually do have a very different form of speaking. And the scope has broadened to include other aspects of communication, which we will look at. Social media, email, popular music, advertising, body language, and sign language. Now, here's a concept that is extremely important. Sapir-Whorf, language shapes culture. If I were to say the color black, What might be associated in your minds is funerals, mourning, evil. In the 1960s, being fluid, it also became a symbol of strength, Black power. White, innocent, pure, virgin. Red, short temper, angry. Yellow, cowardly. So all forms of language, how we hear it, also in context, will shape what we think about things. I'll give you another example in a second. Similarly with gender, how language is used to gender, how we've finally gotten away from he, she, and people are generally allowed to use their personal pronouns is more than political correctness, is a statement of reality. Did I mention that I've been to Alaska 5 times and you haven't? They have 32 words for snow. We have 1, but they need 32 words because it's life or death. They need to describe slush, blizzard, whiteouts, and it all means different things to them. We had some good friends from Alaska visit us a few years ago during what we were thinking was a snowstorm, and their comment was, "What snow are you talking about?" Language is also the key to oppression. Taking away Native Americans' language took away their culture. So much has been done in God's name using language. Native Americans, lately we've gotten a little bit more woke, changing the name of the Redskins and about to change the name of the Indians is very important, because think of how horrible, think of that story I told you earlier about Kelly. Think about if you were had to see a Native American and had to see the mascot of these teams. Now, I want you to watch this PowerPoint, this quick thing about how language dictates how we think. We're almost done with this slideshow because it's getting very close to my bedtime.
I'd like to do something called baseball and football, and thank you. That's nice. Because these two things are such a part of our lives, these two activities, and yet they're so different. Baseball is pastoral, 19th century. Football is technological, 20th century. Baseball is played on a diamond, in a park, the baseball park. Football is played on a gridiron in a stadium, War Memorial Stadium. In baseball, you wear a cap. In football, you wear a helmet. Baseball has a 7th-inning stretch. Football has a 2-minute warning. Baseball has no time limit. We don't know how long it's going to last. We might have extra innings. Football is rigidly timed, and it will end even if we have to go to sudden death. Football is based on downs. What down is it? Baseball is based on ups. Who's up? Are you up? I'm not up. In football, you get a penalty. In baseball, you make an error. Whoops. In baseball, in the stands, there's something of a picnic feeling. You know, emotions may run high, but there's not that much unpleasantness. In football, in the stands, you can be sure that at least 27 times during the game, you were capable of taking the life of a fellow human being. Preferably a stranger. And to sum this up, the objects of the game is quite different. The object of the game in football is for the quarterback, otherwise known as the field general, to be on target with his aerial assault, riddling the defense by hitting his receivers with deadly accuracy in spite of the blitz, even if he has to use the shotgun. With short bullet passes and long bombs, he marches his troops into enemy territory, balancing this aerial assault with a sustained ground attack which punches holes in the forward wall of the enemy's defensive line. In baseball, the object is to go home. I'm going home. I'm going home. Well, I don't have an ending for that, but that'll do until one comes along. You know what I mean?
Good news. I need another break. So go do your homework, and then you could go to part 3. This was the long one, I know.